Dave Wexelman is our speaker. Let me read his bio. He is a retired Forest Service botanist. He has been an amateur astronomer since junior high school when he built his first telescope, an 8-inch reflector. Since those days, Dave has been an avid visual observer and imager of the night sky. One of Dave's favorite pastimes is photographing the Milky Way using Nightscape Photography. And 2 years ago, we got to hear Dave showing us great films of the summer Milky Way and 3D views of what that looks like from the galaxy point of view. It was an excellent talk, and I think it's one of the talks that's gotten more YouTube views on our YouTube site. And last year he gave the lecture on the solar eclipse. So let's welcome Dave. He'll tell you what he's talking about.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming out on a rainy evening, and thanks for joining remotely. So our topic is Nightscape Photography, and most of you know that Nightscape Photography is combining the night sky with the landscape in a single photo. And there's a number of ways we can do that, and we'll talk about that. It's a type of photography that seems to have gained a lot of popularity in, say, the last 20 years. I think a lot of that is because the camera technology is much better with higher ISO settings, handles higher ISOs very well. And also our fast lenses have gotten a lot better at correcting. So I think those are some of the reasons. Now, a lot of nightscapers will try and capture the core of the Milky Way above a landscape because, of course, the core is spectacular and colorful. And that's what I've done here. And this is an image taken just south of Lone Pine, California, looking at the Sierra Nevada, and then above is the core of the Milky Way. But you don't have to photograph the core above the landscape. A lot of people will photograph a constellation, or even the winter Milky Way, or even like a comet, a wide field view of the comet above the landscape. So it doesn't have to be the core, although a lot of people do, because that's pretty spectacular in itself. So a few general tips about nightscape photography that apply across the board. Try to get to a dark sky. And, sort of the consensus is Bortle 4 or darker. Most of you know what the Bortle scale is. It goes from 1 to 9. Nevada City is actually, it looks, I think, rated at Bortle 4 on average in this vicinity. So I like to get to Bortle 4 or darker. Often I'll travel to Northeast California or Northern Nevada to get a Bortle 1 sky for nightscape photography. So try to get to a dark sky. You try to shoot during the new moon phase, or roughly when the moon's out of the sky. A slight crescent is okay because that can illuminate the landscape for your landscape portion of the photo. But you don't want it too bright because it'll wash out the stars, of course. So a slim crescent can work too. Choose the season. As most of you know, you're stargazers, you know that the core of the Milky Way is basically up from March to October, and it's prime in the summertime. You don't have to wait too long. Now, of course, it's early morning. And then the winter Milky Way is the rest of the year. So you can do it year round if you're, if you like photographing the summer core plus the winter Milky Way. And frame the subject, just some general rules. I still like the rule of thirds in general photography rule, where the landscape occupies the bottom third of the photo and the stars occupy the top third of the photo. I think that's a pleasing effect. So I try to, sort of conform to that. Now, since light pollution is a problem, you might think, well, let's just slap a light pollution filter on our lens and we're good to go. Well, it's not quite so easy. And as most of you know, one of the big reasons why it's not so easy is because the proliferation of LED lights. And the problem is that LED spectrum, well, here across the bottom is 400 nanometers to 700 nanometers, which is, of course, roughly what the eye sees is in electromagnetic spectrum. But the LED curve goes like this. If that's the big hump there, And so if you design a filter to filter out LED, you're basically going to cut your Milky Way out because it's going to make it much dimmer. So that's one of the main problems is just the proliferation of LED lights. And from what I've read, at least half of the lighting in the U.S. is now LED. It's only growing. So anyway, filters don't work too well. I've tried it and it just doesn't. I generally just try to get to a dark sky. So a few of the topics that I'm going to talk about are the gear used in nightscape photography, different ways to shoot nightscapes, and just a little bit on processing. Processing nightscapes can be very simple or it can be very involved, depending on, if you want to get really into it. And one of the most important things about nightscape photography, I think, is the lens. A good fast lens that's wide angle, roughly 14 millimeters to 24 millimeters, is good. That's the sort of the sweet spot. And I'll often shoot around f2, but I need a lens that's well corrected about f2, and those are lenses that can be difficult to find. I personally really like the Sigma line of lenses. It's called their ART series, ART. I really like those lenses. They're very well corrected. And they're corrected for aberrations like coma, chromatic aberration, and stigmatism. And looking at those aberrations a little bit closer, most of you are familiar with coma, which occurs at the corner of the image, and that's a defocused star at the corners of the image. And it gets defocused further away from the on-axis light, so it appears like a little comet. Chromatic aberration, which I've shown here in the middle, is where you have a purple fringing, it's called, when the lens fails to focus on all colors of light to the same point. So you have this purple fringing effect, which is common in sort of inferior lenses. And to the right here, I've got a photo of one of my corners where you can see astigmatism. And those where off-axis rays are blurred into a line or an ellipse, often called bat wings. And even the finest lenses, including those Sigma ART series that I talked about, have astigmatism. That's pretty common. It seems to be one of the more difficult aberrations to correct. So this is 100% blow up of one corner of the image. The on-axis or the center of the image is down here. So this is the upper right corner. So bat wings and astigmatism is fairly common in lenses, even the best corrected ones.
Is it possible to get a quick explanation of tangential versus sagittal?
The only thing thing I could add, Alan, is that the sagittal are curves that where's my cursor? Oh, that guy. They sort of go radial to the center of the image, whereas tangential are lines formed from the center toward the edge. Does that make sense? So they're 90 degrees to each other. So, yeah, and holler out any questions or comments, or feel free to do so. Yeah, good question, Alan. So you'll want to plan the shot, especially if you're doing, say, a core of the Milky Way. If you're a Milky Way observer, you know the core is up in the summertime, ideally. But a good program to use, software that I use, is Stellarium, which Greg was using earlier. And I really like Stellarium because I can input a date and time and location. And then I can, up in this corner here, I can input my camera and the lens I'm using, and it will frame the picture for you. So that's very handy. And here I've got it framed for the core of the Milky Way in April of 2024, April 11th at 3 a.m. in the morning. And I'll get to that shot a little bit later, but that helped me plan the shot. So,
Is that based on a 2¼ lens, or does
Full frame.
give you a square?
it's the full. It's based on a Canon R full frame mirrorless. So you just input your lens, and it will frame. You know, whether you have a crop or whatever, it'll frame. And I should have mentioned earlier, I use the Canon series simply because I started with Canon lenses. So I use Canon R series. That's what I use. And, you know, I have good friends that use Nikon and Sony and so forth. I use the Canon R series. Now, that gives you the framing in the sky, but what if you want to have the stars above a landscape, say a rock formation, or in this case, the South Yuba River, where the bridge crosses the South Yuba there, and then there's a walking bridge just upstream from that, the one you drive on. I don't know if there's a name for that bridge. But anyway, I wanted to take a picture of the stars above the Yuba River from that walking bridge just above Highway 49 there on the South Yuba. There's a program called TPE, which is the Photographer's Ephemeris. It's called B Photographer's Ephemeris, TPE. Similar to photopills, but I don't use photopills. I use TPE. So I input the date and time, and then TPE will let you select a geographical location on a map, and it will give you the view from that bridge based on relative to the topography. So here's the South Yuba River looking upstream on June 2nd, 2024 at a certain time, and with my 20 millimeter lens I can put in 20 millimeters, and it will give me roughly the view that I'm going to see at a certain time with the Milky Way and Cygnus here just above the South Yuba River. So I can plan a shot relative to topography if I really want to, get exact about what the shot's going to look like. And then I went out there and photographed, and it looks like this. Although, does that nebula actually show? Not too well. There should be, these are reddish nebula here.
And they show.
Okay, anyway, this is Cygnus right here, North American Nebula here. So anyway, that's the shot I got of that particular evening.
So that program has topographic information in it
Yes.
for the whole country?
Yes,
or-
like a digital elevation model built into it. Very, very helpful. So, yeah. So Stellarium and TPE are two software I use. So Nightscape shooting methods. I've sort of broken down the methods into three categories. They're sort of subcategories too, but anyway, you can take single shot untracked nightscape, which are just one image, untracked, short exposure, okay, that captures the sky and the landscape all in one shot. But you have to take a short exposure to keep the stars pinpoint because you're not guiding, not tracking. And then you can use the 400 rule, which is basically take 400, divide it by the focal length of your lens, and that gives you the number of seconds, maximum number of seconds you can shoot before the stars start trailing. Okay. So for a 20 millimeter lens, you would divide 400 by 20, and you would get 20 seconds. So that's your maximum exposure you can do before the stars start trailing. So there's a limitation there. The second type of imaging you can do is stacking multiple untracked images. In other words, just stacking a whole bunch of these. Just take one after the other, say up to 20 or so, and just stack them in software. And that gives you a better signal to noise ratio than just number one. Okay, just one image. And then the third type is called tracked images, and we're going to talk more about all these. But in a tracked image, you use a star tracker and follow the stars, and you can take several minutes of exposures and really build up a lot of signal to noise in those kinds of images. And that's mostly what I do. But you have to buy a tracker and so forth. But we'll talk a little bit more about that. So for just this single shot untracked nightscape image, this is basically the equipment that you use. You need a wide field lens, which you talked about, roughly 14 to 40 millimeters, f2.8 or faster. And in this case, I have a Sigma 20 millimeter 1.4 art I'm using there. Also the camera, I use the Canon R series. I have a Canon RA, Canon R6 Mark II. Both pretty good Milky Way cameras. And a ball head to support it on the tripod. A nice tripod with a center column. I prefer a center column. I like to have a leveling bubble here so I can level the shot. Okay. Now, cameras usually have in-screen leveling devices, but I prefer a leveling bubble. Headlamp with a red light and an intervalometer attached to the camera so you can program the number of shots and the duration.
What's the center column mean?
Tripod with a center column, you can raise the center column of the tripod so that you can raise the camera above the
Okay.
base of the tripod. And that's because sometimes you want to turn the camera over into portrait mode, and if you don't have a center column, the base of the tripod can get in the way. So that can be very frustrating. So pretty simple equipment. I come from a background of deep space photography, deep sky photography with a telescope, and it's so nice to just carry out just a few things and like a couple of arms, and that do your photography. I really like the simplicity. So that number one method we talked about was a single shot, short exposure. And here I am. Here we're in Yosemite National Park, just south of Sentinel Rock, in a meadow here, just north of Sentinel Rock. Actually, we're shooting south towards the Milky Way. And the steps that I used to take this simple photo were set the camera mode to bulb, set the focus mode to manual. The format goes to RAW, not JPEG, but to RAW. Focus on the stars using live view. These mirrorless cameras these days have a live view and a magnification, so on the screen you can just zoom into a star and get the smallest star there and just turn the focus knob and focus. Okay, so I'm setting the ISO to 3200 and the f-stop to 2.2 on the camera. I programmed the intervalometer to 14 seconds using the 400 rule. I level the camera, frame the scene, and take the shot. And this is what I got. Okay.
And what's intervalometer?
That is the little device that attaches to the camera where you can tell it to take the number of shots and the length of each shot.
Okay.
But in this case, we're only taking one shot, but you just say 14 seconds, one shot, and you press the button. That way you're not, touching the camera, and you're not inducing vibration, so that's a good thing. So, and then when you download the image and you push it a little bit in Photoshop, do a little bit of other things, you come up with an image something like this. But the issue with doing such a simple shot at a high ISO is you're going to get some noise in the image when you go to process it. And here I've shown a one-to-one blow-up here of this corner over here, and there's a lot of grain. So on Facebook or something, this will be a fairly nice picture, but it's not one that I would print because it's got so much noise in it. Again, it's just a single shot at high ISO. Now, there's a couple things we can do to reduce noise in the landscape part of our image and maybe help that last image out a little bit, and that is shoot during the blue hour and then blend with the night photo. So here I am in Texas near Big Bend National Park. I knew that Comet Pons-Brooks was going to be in the sky that night at this azimuth. So with an 80mm lens at blue hour, I took about a 4-second exposure at a low ISO, and that became my landscape shot. Then about 2 hours later, after astronomical twilight, I take a photo of Comet Pons-Brooks with the same lens, same direction, and then blend them in Photoshop, and this is the image you get.
Why is it called a blue hour?
Because it's dusk when the blue light is strongest, so they just call it blue hour. You can call it a twilight shot or blue hour shot. But blue hour is a common phrase that people use. So that's one way to improve the landscape in your images. So I could have improved the, I think I'll show it in a little bit, that Yosemite picture with a blue hour landscape shot and blended that with the stars. That would have made a nicer picture. I think I've got that later on. So here's one that I sent email to the group a while back. This is an untracked nightscape, but I'm shooting the foreground separate, just like I talked about. Okay, and the moon is illuminating the foreground, so the crescent moon was helpful in that regard. But I wanted to take 2 shots because I wanted a wide open shot, f2 or so, of the stars with a diffusion filter to brighten the brighter stars. It's a nice effect. But then I wanted a landscape shot closed down at f16 or so to get a lot of depth of field and the close landscape here in focus. So it's all in focus. So then I took those 2 shots and blended them in Photoshop. And this is what I got. So, yeah. So if I would have taken just one shot of the sky at f2, this would have been blurry down here and it wouldn't have the depth that I wanted. Right? Plus I wanted to use a diffusion filter, and on the landscape would have been all diffused and and sort of mushy. It wouldn't have been sharp. So I took two shots, and that's one.
Is that Canon R, is that a mirrorless?
Yes, it's mirrorless. And it's, how many megapixels? 28, 30 megapixels roughly.
Pardon?
Roughly 30 megapixels, mirrorless.
Are you gonna talk about blending?
I'm sorry?
Are you gonna talk about blending?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah,
Oh, wait,
it's toward the end.
yeah, so,
And so now we've covered single shot untracked, okay, and we had a variation on that because we blended it with the blue hour foreground if we wanted to. But now we're going to move on to stacking, and stacking increases the signal to noise, and it really helps with that noise that we talked about with one high ISO shot. Okay, you're going to keep these exposures and everything the same as in number one, but now you're going to take a bunch of successive photos and stack them in software. And what that does is the process is basically goes like this. The signal emitted by the stars is constant, and this signal will be boosted relative to the noise as you stack multiple images together. The noise in the image is random, and the stacking will essentially cancel the noise out. Okay, and the effect is to increase the signal to noise ratio. So many of you have heard about stacking. That's generally just what the process, how it goes. The whole reason is to increase the signal to noise ratio.
Do you use a dark frame?
I sometimes do. Yeah, it helps with hot pixels. Okay, but this camera is pretty good about, I don't usually have a big problem with hot pixels, but if it's something I want to print, I'll do dark. So number two, we're on to the second general thing here. And here is that same Yosemite photo, but stacked using 6 photos instead of a single photo. Okay, the sky is a little bit cleaner. There's not as much grain. We've got a little more detail in our rocks, in our landscape here, by stacking 6 exposures as compared to just a single exposure. And the software I use is called Sequator. It's for Windows. There's a Mac software too. Starry Night Stacker, I think it's called. But anyway, I use Sequator because I'm using Windows. And it's a free program, but it'll do the stacking for you. You can stack it in Photoshop too, but Sequator does a good job. Now here's that same Yosemite photo, but I've taken a blue hour landscape photo at dusk and then merged that with the sky. But look how much better our landscape is and how much richer it is, because the blue hour you have enough light to really make the landscape show. Whereas if you're taking it at dark, the camera struggles to pull in the resolution on the landscape. But so I use this technique a lot, where I'll shoot a blue hour photo and then just hang out till it's dark, and then take their sky photo and then process them together. So let's move on to the third sort of general way of taking these nightscapes, and that is to attract an image. Now we're using a star tracker to follow the stars. So we're not limited by a short exposure anymore. We can take several minutes, even up to 8 or 10 minutes, okay, at a low ISO number. And now we're going to get a nice clean image with a high signal to noise ratio, because we're using that lower ISO and we're building up a lot of data over several minutes. This is the method I prefer. And all we're doing is adding a star tracker, in this case an Ioptron SkyGuider Pro. It has a little polar scope in it that you can look through and line up with the North Star, because you're going to have to be aligned to the North Star because it's, of course, tracking. And then you need a latitude adjuster below that. And that's the only thing you need to add relative to those other methods we're talking about. So Star Tracker, this runs about $300. But it's very portable, and you can charge it with a cell phone charger and just take it out. Very, very easy. Here's a single tracked exposure for the stars plus a blue hour landscape photo. Okay. Now we have a really nice clean sky with a lot of detail, and you can really push these in Photoshop and get a lot of color and a lot of definition in your Milky Way because of the length of the exposure and because of the excellent noise reduction there. And then you can see the light. This was taken from Likely, California, up north, northeast California. Some of you know where that is. Here's the sky glow from Reno to the south. And anyway, the Milky Way above the juniper trees from a Bortle 1 sky. So anyway, yeah. Now, if you want to pull in some of that hydrogen alpha nebulosity in the Milky Way, you need an astro-modified camera, we call it. We call it a mod camera, okay? And what that is the your off-the-shelf commercial DSLRs or mirrorless cameras have what's called an IR cut filter. And what that filter does, follow the blue line down here, is it cuts off in the early red, and the infrared is totally cut out. Here's the H-alpha spectral line right here, and basically the Canon IR cut filter cuts out all but about 20% of that hydrogen emission line. Okay, so if you want to catch the hydrogen alpha nebulosity, that's not good. So if you have a camera modded, they replace the IR cut filter with a filter that's higher in transmission at the H-alpha line and higher in transmission in the red in general. So this red line here now is the transmission line for that replacement filter. And Botter makes one of those replacement filters. And so often it's called a Botter modification. And so that's called a modded camera. And now if you mod your camera like that, you can catch that hydrogen alpha nebulosity in your photos. The only downside is that your photos are going to look a little bit red because they're passing a lot of red, but you just adjust the white balance in Photoshop and you're good to go. So there's a few extra steps in processing, but the great thing is you can catch your hydrogen alpha nebulosity.
Is that very hard to do, modify it?
No, it's not at all. So here's a picture now from Loney Meadow, just up the road here. Can you see the hydrogen alpha nebulosity starting to show here? Does that show up on the screen? Okay. So here's Zeta Ophiuchus nebula here. Here's the Rho Ophiuchus nebula here. I don't know if the lagoon shows up here or not. Really does on my screen. But anyway, lagoon is there. So you get the idea. With that modified camera, I'm taking a tracked single exposure through the filter, hydrogen alpha filter that I was talking about, and with that modded camera, and it's picking up that hydrogen alpha signal. And then the landscape again is a blue hour photo, and they're blended together in Photoshop.
So essentially, you're just basically doing a video? Is that how you're getting the images to stack?
No, you're taking two separate images, and then you're
Well, okay, when you're doing the tracked single exposure, oh, okay, so you're just getting one photo,
yeah, one photo like
Okay.
3 minutes long.
okay, all right.
Okay, at ISO 400 at f2, and then I'm done with the stars, right? And then I combine that with my blue hour landscape photo from the same location, same tripod location, and same direction. Then I just blend those in Photoshop. Make sense?
I see mine down there. Thank you.
Okay, so that's what they call a modified camera to pick up hydrogen alpha. So now we're starting to see some of the hydrogen alpha there. Okay. Now, let's say you really want to catch more of the hydrogen alpha data than just a modded camera will. Well, you can take another step. It just so happens that for the Canon R series of cameras, Canon makes a filter slider that you can attach to the camera and then attach your lens to that. Okay, so you can go to Agena Astro online, buy a hydrogen alpha filter that's actually a bicolor filter with hydrogen, lets through hydrogen alpha and O3, slide that in, and now take a photo of several minutes tracked through that filter and capture all kinds of H-alpha data. Okay, and when you do that, well, here's the transmission. H-alpha transmission here is 10 nanometers. It's 8 nanometers for O3. I usually just use the HA data from these images. And when you do that, look at all the HA there. I don't know how that looks when the screen looks kind of, anyway, maroon from here, but that's supposed to be bright red.
It's pretty bright.
Is it? Yeah. Is it?
Blinded by almost.
Anyway,
So now are you taking 3 photos?
exactly. So now you've got a 3 exposure blend. You've taken a tracked 3-minute exposure or longer through the H alpha filter. You've taken a tracked star picture without the filter in it, okay, to capture the real color of the stars. And you've taken a blue hour landscape photo. Now you've got 3 photos and you're blending them in Photoshop. Okay, does that make sense?
So we're seeing just excited hydrogen just
Yeah,
blasting
pop.
us.
Yeah, yeah.
Would you say once again what the blue hour,
Blue hour is twilight.
okay,
And it's just a photography term that the photographers use because blue light is strong at that time of day. Yeah. And again, this is from Lonely Meadow. And I like to just park up there with the trailhead. And most of you have been there, I'm sure. And hiked it, anyway, Lonely Meadow, you can park off in the trees and walk out into the meadow. It's pretty nice place to take pictures of, although the sky, the light pollution from Sacramento can be a problem off to the right here. So that's kind of an issue. And here's the winter Milky Way from the Mono Lake Basin. And you can see the hydrogen alpha nebulosity, emission nebulosity around Orion here. It really pops with that filter.
Awesome.
So again, this is 3 exposures blended. 2 exposures for the sky, 1 exposure for the landscape, the blue hour, and they're all blended.
This is hers.
And this is a photo from Bryce Canyon National Park that was published actually in the Astronomy magazine in December 2024 issue. And I got up at 3 o'clock in the morning, headed out to Bryce Sunset Point, 3:30 a.m. to get this shot. And
that snow on the mountains?
yes,
Okay.
and I planned it with using TPE, that topographic planning software I showed you earlier. I planned that shot with this, okay? And I was heading out there. I took the blue hour shot. Tina and I took the blue hour shot from the same point at sunset. And then I came back at 3 o'clock in the morning. I was concerned that I wouldn't be able to get the shot because this is an iconic location and there's going to be other people wanting to shoot Milky Way, right? And I was right. I got there 15 minutes. I set up my tripod. Nobody there. As soon as I set the tripod down at Sunset Point, right against the railing, 2 cars show up. Astrophotographers wanting to shoot the Milky Way from that exact same spot. Because if you've been to Sunset Point, the rails kind of go into a point, and it's the best spot to be right there, okay? So anyway, it just shows you the popularity. I can't imagine going there in the middle. This was in April, in the middle of the week, at 3:30 a.m. in the morning, and people were competing for a spot to shoot the Milky Way. It just tells you what the popularity of this type of photography is getting to be. So. Stacking short, untracked exposures versus tracking. So the advantages we've already talked about, disadvantages we've already kind of talked about, but I'll just review them real quick. With stacking many short exposures of, say, 10 to 20 seconds, the disadvantage is it requires a much higher ISO, resulting in more noise and less dynamic range. Okay, and then the advantages are, though, that you do not require a star tracker. And you're doing short exposures using the 400 rule. But if you're tracking, then the exposures can be several minutes or longer, and the advantage is that you're using lower ISO, resulting in much less noise and much higher dynamic range in the image. Okay. Disadvantage requires a star tracker, and the ground moves during the tracking, so you must take a separate ground exposure. And then you have to polar align the tracker on Polaris. But once you got used to a star tracker, it's second nature. It's really pretty easy. And down here, I've set up a little comparison. If you were going to expose for the same amount of time, and you were going to stack a bunch of short exposures, how would that compare as if you took one shot for the same amount of time tracking? Okay, so total exposure time, 3 minutes with a 20 millimeter lens at f2.8. And we're going to stack 9 exposures of 20 seconds. And we're going to compare that at ISO 3200. And then we're going to compare that versus 1 3-minute tracked exposure at ISO 400. Okay, so a lot of people ask this question. And I would rather do the tracked exposure because I think I get slightly better signal to noise and color out of the tracked image if I'm shooting. You see what I'm saying? And so, but there's times where you can only do maybe the untracked short exposure. Maybe you're camping or something, you're hiking, and you can't carry a tracker or something like that. So there's definitely times when you will do the untracked shots because you have to. But I like track shots because they give me, I think, a little bit more dynamic range to play with. And let's do, somebody asked about blending. Let's do a real quick blending thing. This is the last few slides I have. And I'm going to start with your star photo. This is a stack of short exposures, okay, from Manning Provincial Park in southern Canada. Nice spot, okay. And I've processed my stack of star exposures, okay, and I've got that all ready to go. So let's say that we got our stars all ready to go. Now we're going to open Photoshop, okay, and we're going to bring in our blue hour photo, landscape photo that we took a couple hours earlier, okay, from the same spot. Now we're going to go up to Edit here and click on Edit in Photoshop, and it's going to bring down a menu, and in that menu you're going to click on Sky Replacement, okay? And when you click on Sky Replacement, this menu comes up here, this little window comes up here. You can import your star photo into this little window right here. And Photoshop will mask out your sky for you and replace the sky with whatever you tell it to. Okay? And when you tell it to replace the sky with your star photo, this is what you get. It will mask out the sky and replace the sky with your star photo. So it's really quite easy. Now, it's sometimes not that easy, but for horizons that are pretty clear and distinct like this, without any trees, then Photoshop does it very quickly for you. And it's always what I try first as far as blending the two images together. So if you're blending a star image with your blue hour landscape photo, it can be as simple as that.
Is that true south? Is that, it could be, you can put it in any direction of the stars, any direction, even if it's looking south, you can be looking this way, you can Photoshop that much? Or is it aligned with that southern direction?
It's aligned with the southern direction.
Oh, it is, okay.
Yeah, now see, I did not move the tripod or the camera
Okay.
between shots.
Because south before was a little overcast, you know, a little bit.
Oh, well, that was because when you opened Sky Replacement, it pulled up its own random photo.
Okay, I gotta know.
Yeah, I should have
Okay.
explained that.
Okay.
Yeah, you're right, the sky looked a little.
Okay.
And so, yeah. So that's a real quick blend example. And I'll just
Neat, yeah.
I'll just end with this shot. This was Comet Atlas last fall, and from Kybers Meadow, just north of Truckee. And this is not sunlight, this is moonlight, because the moon, there was only a short window between darkness and moonrise. And moon was right, almost full moon was rising in the east. So I took a star photo, including the comet, right at darkness, right after astronomical twilight. Then the moon came up, and I took a photo of the landscape by moonlight, and then blended those two in Photoshop. So that's how this picture came about. So that's all I have. So thanks for listening.
Very good.
Any questions, or do we have time?
I have a question. There are photos earlier where, like you're saying, there were a lot of trees, and then sometimes you'd see a a star among the trees. So I'm just wondering, and that was probably not the Photoshop program, or maybe a different program that's used. How does it blend, you know, because they're obviously taken at different times, although the camera's in the same location. How does it know, you know, where the cutoff is? How does it blend those photos, given, you know, could there be like, you know, a star that's right next to a tree that might be partially blocked, or, you know, how
It
does it,
separates
is there a
the-
program that just does that
Yes,
automatically?
yes, it separates the sky. It's called a luminosity mask. And what all you're doing is separating the sky from the blue hour photo that you took before. And in other words, when you take a picture of the sky, those tree limbs are going to show up, okay? They're going to be blurred a little bit, but they're going to show up. And if your blue hour photo was taken from exactly the same place, then you can superimpose the blue hour photo on top of those dark limbs, and it will replace the dark limbs with your blue hour limbs. Does that make sense?
Right, so, because the trees are in exactly the same place,
Right.
I sort of imagine you start out with one and then put the other over it, so you put the landscape on top of
Right,
the
right,
other ones, and then that would solve the problem.
right, right.
Gotcha, okay. It's not selecting out certain things in the sky.
No, no, it's not
you're
messing with
putting
the sky
You're
at
putting
all.
the ground in kind of after the sky.
Right, exactly.
So on a 3-minute exposure, if you're tracking, how much do the trees move?
A little bit. And that's where the trick comes in. Yeah, so that can be difficult. And that's why you have to sort of balance the length of your exposure with the complexity of the scene. That's one reason why I track, is because I want to take a long enough exposure, but not too long, and at a low ISO, and so the trees don't move too much. Now, a lot of people will they'll sort of, it's not cheating, but it's, you know, take artist license, okay, and move maybe a little bit to where it's clear, and they'll take the shot, and then they'll take the tree shot somewhere, and then they'll blend it onto the sky, because then you don't have any trees blurring during your star shot, but you can pick any foreground you want and superimpose it on that, right?
Yeah.
If it's in the same area, in the same general direction, then it still maintains some accuracy in the real world. But to your point, those trees move a little bit, and you don't want them to move a whole lot, so you adjust your settings appropriately, right? Good question. Good question. Yes, Greg?
So one of the features of Sequator is you can freeze the foreground and stack the sky.
Yes.
Do you use that?
Yes, and that is meant for the short exposures that are untracked.
So
Okay.
if you're tracking, the foreground's gonna start moving.
Right.
So how do you deal with that?
See, your foreground moves a little bit, yeah, but not much.
So you just use one foreground image.
Mhm.
You don't stack the foreground
No,
if you're tracking, okay.
no, I'm sorry. The foreground is untracked. And, yeah,
You gotta do it when you have 7-mile-per-hour wind gusts.
Camera.
Yeah.
fold it up. Yeah. Yeah, so the nice thing about wide field is, I can get 15-mile-an-hour winds and I'm okay.
Oh, okay.
But as you
Say
know,
50 or 15?
15.
Oh, 15, okay.
But a 10-mile or 12-mile-an-hour wind at deep sky photography will shut you down, right?
Oh, yeah.
Usually.
That's neat.
Thanks, David.
Great, thank you.